Activists believe the stigma associated with being HIV positive is still impacting the efficacy of treatment. Now, certain groups like sex workers have challenges of their own. Activists say criminalization of sex work often prevents prostitutes from seeking medical treatment. While joining me now on the line from my Cape Town studios is Dr. Gordon Isaacs, Innovation Manager at the Sex Workers Education and Advocacy Taskforce. And in our Pretoria studios, we're joined by HIV clinician and researcher Dr. Theresa Rossouw. Firstly, good morning to both of you, and thank you so much for joining us for this discussion. Perhaps let me begin in Cape Town. Dr. Gordon Isaacs, we're seeing that the prevalence rate among sex workers still remains quite high. In 2012, that's 2 years ago, the numbers were sitting at around 44% to 69%. What do those numbers look like today?
Thank you for inviting me. The numbers are still the same. And very interestingly, in a recent publication by the Lancet Medical Journal, there's very strong evidence to suggest that if sex work is decriminalized and the human rights of sex workers are acknowledged, the incidence rate of new infections would drop by almost 30%. So the incidence and prevalence rate is still very, very high.
And, you know, Theresa, you're a researcher, and part of your work would obviously also include looking into statistics of this nature. Do you find that the problem in this regard is mostly around the actual protection, or rather that there's just not enough information out there within the space of work?
I think it's probably a combination of both, Kathy. It's a very complex dynamic that is at play. So I think there needs to be better protection, and that means that people need to have easy access to healthcare and proper preventative measures. So if sex work is decriminalized, it will mean that people have easy access to antiretroviral treatment, and we know that that is the most effective way to prevent HIV from spreading.
When we look at the program that was launched also 2 years ago that by the South African National AIDS Council, and it was particularly targeting sex workers, has that project been effective at all 2 years on? Do you believe that government is doing what it needs to be doing effectively?
Government is beginning to come to the party. Sorry. You want me to?
No. It's okay, Gordon. You can go ahead.
Government is beginning to come to the party. There's a national sex work sector within the plan, and there's a national sex work program. However, there are delays, there are structural concerns, and one of the major problems is the access of the voices of sex workers to be able to articulate what they want, how they need it, and how they experience the levels of systemic stigma within the context of a criminalized environment. For example, one example is the confiscation of condoms by police. So we would do outreaches, we would go to brothels, street-based centers, and do messaging, condom drops with lubrication, and sex workers have reported that they would get arrested on the allegation of either soliciting or running a brothel. So there's a double bind that persistently exists in the prevention and or the treatment of HIV.
And Theresa, do you find that there's also discrimination, particularly against sex workers, where getting treatment is concerned? How is the rollout of ARVs, particularly for that sector?
Absolutely. I think in our sector where we're working, we've seen very little progress in terms of making these services accessible. You know, we tend to give a one-size-fits-all approach to all our patients, and clearly this is not the way to do this, especially if we want to accommodate minority groups.
And how much more work still needs to be done? Because both of you are talking about the decriminalization of sex work. How much work does government, or do we still need to do in order to convince government that this may be the way to go, particularly for this group that is considered as a vulnerable sector? Perhaps let's start with you, Gordon.
Yes, we have a lot of work to do. The South African Law Commission, I believe, is sitting. It's taken them 12 years to begin to start the process whereby they can present to Parliament changes in the Sexual Offences Act. We need to mobilize sex workers with our partner organization, Sisonke, which represents the voices of sex workers for sex workers. We have to initiate and sustain sensitivity training within the healthcare professions, the police within schools, so in order to reduce the impact of stigma. In my opinion, the HIV can be managed very, very effectively. It's the context of stigma and prejudice that worries me.
And Theresa, with the research that you do, what happens to sex workers who are found to be HIV positive? Do they continue, do they continue practicing as sex workers, or are there any rules and guidelines around that?
I think it is very diverse. We certainly see a large number staying in sex work, but we are able to make it safer by giving them access to better information and, as I said, also adequate treatment. The problem for me is that we can't keep people in care, probably because the healthcare system is structured in such a way that it's not very conducive to somebody having a full-time job or somebody have to go out and earn a living. Because we expect them to be in queues for the entire day, they need to come back to the clinic at least monthly, sometimes bi-monthly, and this is really a deterrent for patients to stay on treatment.
And Theresa, perhaps let's just continue with the discussion around what actually happens when people are on treatment outside of just, having to be at clinics on a monthly basis. There's also the issue of being able to have food that you can actually take your medication with. Do you find that that's still such a challenge, considering the high unemployment rates that we're seeing in South Africa and particularly amongst young people?
Most definitely. We do find that a large proportion of our patients are really poor. They don't have access to regular food. They don't have proper support systems. We try to facilitate access to food parcels, but there's just not enough going around. So access to just the basic amenities for living is really still a major challenge.
And this year we have the theme of stigma and really trying to remove the negative connotations that are associated with HIV/AIDS. Looking at where we are as a country today, do you think that we're winning this fight? First you, Theresa.
I do think stigma is getting better. A lot of it has to do with treatment being easier to take. Also with fewer side effects, that people don't get the very dysmorphic features that we found on the old medications. So I do find that people are more easily discussing their status, being more open about treatment. But we have not won the fight by any means. We still see a lot of discrimination, sometimes from healthcare workers, sometimes from people who just don't have the right information. So there's a lot of work that still needs to be done.
And Dr. Isaacs, particularly for the group of people that you work with in the sex industry, do you find that the challenges outside of the decriminalisation of sex work are still really great?
The challenges are great. We must remember that the sex work industry comprises male sex workers, female transgender sex workers who have different kinds of risks attached to this particular group. We have pockets of spaces whereby stigma is certainly reduced, but there is a long road ahead, particularly in terms of screening, of maintaining one's health, and also compliance and adherence. More and more sex workers and even their clients are being screened, and there's a willingness to be screened for HIV, TB, STIs. When, however, they are advised to go onto medication, antiretrovirals, the difficulty around adhering to the medications and compliance because of either personal or structural barriers still remains a big concern for us.
All right, well, we're going to continue this conversation throughout the day. Of course, it is World AIDS Day. If you want to be part of it, our hashtag on Twitter is hashtag World AIDS Day. And that was Dr. Gordon Isaacs, Innovation Manager at the Sex Workers Education and Advocacy Taskforce, and also joined by our researcher, HIV clinician and researcher, Dr. Theresa Lowe. Thank you so much for your time again this morning to both of you.